All right.
In terms of authority and power, what would some of the specific differences be between monarchs, both medieval and early modern, and modern heads of state, especially the American presidency?
Well, interestingly enough, there's not as much difference between uh, monarchs of that era and the current president, the American president, as you might think. I mean, the American president has a lot more power than they did. But in terms of uh, modern constitutional monarchs and the presidents in what are called parliamentary republics, there's a world of difference. You see, uh, in a constitutional monarchy like the Commonwealth and Britain, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and so forth, Japan, and in parliamentary republics like Italy, Poland, Lithuania, Austria, Portugal. Um, in those countries like that, the head of state is a figurehead. Now, if he's a monarch, he does have a certain amount of soft power that comes from his being united with national traditions and being a living flag and all that kind of thing. If he's a president of a country like Austria or Germany or Italy or wherever, he's basically a retired politician who usually has been elected not by the people, but by parliament. And so in Austria, for instance, everybody knows the name of the Archduke Karl, who would be the heir to the throne. But a lot of Austrians don't know the name of the president of Austria. And the same is true in Italy and Portugal. So, uh, in a sense, the president of a parliamentary republic is the most powerless of all heads of state. But in any case, in such a setup, the chancellor or the prime minister is called the head of government. He's the effective ruler. And as long as he's got a majority in parliament, he can do whatever he wants, which is more than a medieval monarch could have done. The same is true of a presidential republic like the United States, France, Latin America. But there, the head of state is the head of government. So it's more analogous to a medieval monarch than modern monarchs are, which is it's a little convoluted to understand. Now, turning it around, however, I've long held that if there are no in the West, there are no executive monarchs the way there are executive presidents. There are none. Well, no, I take that back. The Prince of Liechtenstein, the only one. Outside of him, such people don't exist. But I have every belief that if you had a ruler who was hereditary with a written constitution that gave him specifically the powers given the President of the United States, and no more, popular opinion probably would not allow him to do any more than it states precisely in the Constitution, which is not the case with the American, French, or Latin American presidents, precisely because people can vote for them. So they're willing to let them skate, thinking that they've got some kind of control because they can vote. But of course, that particular superstition is beginning to die in a big way, even in the United States.
Yeah.
And not for good reasons. You know, this is one of the ironies, and I mentioned this on Facebook, but I do want to mention it. And that is that, you know, most of my life, monarchism for Americans has been a fringe of the fringe of the fringe. So tiny a minority that there's no point even discussing it. In my time, and especially in the past 10 years, I have seen it become less marginal. But I'm all too aware that that's because our systems, our structure has decayed so much. And it's an ironic position for me to be in because, you know, I miss the country I was born and raised in. I miss the fact that my views seem so insane because the system works so well. Does that sound strange?
No, it doesn't.
And yet, I can't, by the same token, I know that in recent months, a lot of Catholic young people who have begun to explore what our tradition has, not just religiously, but also in terms of our political past, getting a lot of guff from people my age and older for LARPing, you're not being realistic, blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem with that attitude, number one, nothing is going to get better if young people don't explore things and dream dreams. We're living right now in the nightmare that the older half of my generation dreamed. They got what they wanted, and it's horrible, but they got it. I think that the young people should be able to dream and hope and search for something better. And to add to it the poignancy for me, when I was in my 20s, bad as things were in the church, Pope John Paul II came to the throne, and he didn't make everything wonderful by a long shot, but he did start the process that ended with Summorum Pontificum, and he restored Eucharistic devotion. People forget that there was no or very little adoration or benediction in the last years of Paul VI. I don't think I saw benediction once from 1968 to 1980. People forget that. And then politically, Ronald Reagan came to the throne. And in both cases, John Paul II and Reagan, for those of us of somewhat like opinion, it was the feeling that we once again had adult leadership and that the craziness of the 60s was at last being put behind us. And then a few years later, to crown the thing, the Soviet Union and its satellites fell. It's hard to express what a joy that was. And even with all the terrible stuff that's happened since, that joy, it's difficult to erase for me. It's still great. And of course, living here in Austria now and knowing all sorts of Eastern Europeans whom I couldn't possibly know, and many of whom who would never have been born had the wall not fallen. I mean, it's still great. So the point I'm making is that when I was young, we had dreams to dream, and they seemed to be coming true. Now, 40 years later, I look at the kids my age of, again, a similar ideological bent, and it's just miserable for them, and they have nothing good to look forward to. And what they get from people my age, even those who are more or less supposedly on their side, is, you're LARPing or you're rigid. That's just the wrong tack to take. I understand why my contemporaries feel that way. They feel that this is all daydreaming and so on and so forth, and we've got to get back to the business at hand, which is restoring the situation of our youth. Well, except for the fact that we ourselves lived through it, that's as much of a pipe dream as bringing in a monarchy. In fact, as things stand at the moment, anything different from what we've got, the regime of masks and curfews, is LARPing. I'll take you a step further. Our lords and masters with this great reset, they're dreaming, they're LARPing. God alone knows what reality is actually going to give us all, masters and subjects. Because, the funny thing is, patriarch conspiracy theorists and patriarch masters themselves, we're actually a lot more tightly tied together than people understand. Our masters certainly don't understand it. That's the problem. With them poisoning the well, as it were, they're not doing themselves any good. Not at all. And a lot of very well-intended people who have access to them in hopes of getting something better out of the wreck go along with their deal. I won't say who I'm thinking of, but suffice to say, when I look at the names that are going to be at Davos to discuss the Great Reset, I know who I mean. And I know they're very decent people who believe that the only way to save anything is to deal with those who actually have power. Well, that's a risky strategy, and I don't bet much on it working. But who can tell? In the immortal words of J.R.R. Tolkien, not even the wise can see all ends. And I would preface that or amend that remark by saying I certainly am not one of the wise. So we'll see what happens.